Before we begin, I want to be clear about the context for this conversation. What I'm about to share are confidential remarks intended for this audience and grounded in real-world observation rather than theory. I am Steve Colino. Let's get started. When people talk about disruption, they often describe it as a single moment, a launch, a breakthrough, a sudden collapse. But disruption almost never works that way. It behaves more like an earthquake. There is an initial shock, but the real impact comes from the aftershocks. And those aftershocks are not random. They are highly predictable. What matters most isn't simply that disruption occurs. It's how organizations respond once it does. And those responses, across industries and over time, follow patterns that are far more consistent than we tend to admit. Industries don't collapse because technology changes. Technology is just the trigger. What really causes failure is the human response to change. When a new model threatens an established one, the reaction is rarely innovative at first. It's defensive, emotional, and surprisingly consistent. Over time, those reactions form a script, one that shows up across industries, across decades, and across entirely different technologies. Once you recognize that script, disruption stops feeling chaotic. It becomes something you can read, interpret, and anticipate. When industries face real disruption, they almost always move through the same 4 psychological stages. First, they deny the threat. Then they try to delegitimize it. When that no longer works, they shift to moral arguments. And finally, they lose the authority to define the market altogether. This progression isn't about strategy decks or business models. It's about identity, about what happens when organizations protect who they've been instead of confronting what the market is becoming. To make this tangible, let's look at one of the most visible disruptions of the last decade, the clash between the traditional taxi industry and ride-sharing platforms. This case is useful not because it's dramatic, but because it's clean. The industry's response maps almost perfectly to each stage of the framework. It's not a story about right or wrong. It's a case study in how predictable disruption really is. At this stage, the new model is brushed off as a novelty, a niche product, something that might exist on the margins but doesn't pose a real threat. Calling it not real makes it easier to ignore. And if it can be ignored, then nothing fundamental has to change yet. Once denial stops working, once adoption grows and momentum becomes undeniable, the response escalates. Now, the focus shifts to rules and credentials. The argument becomes that the new model doesn't count because it isn't legitimate. It's operating outside the system. It's breaking norms or regulations. What's important here is this: the incumbent still isn't competing. It's trying to invalidate the disruption instead of responding to it. When procedural arguments lose their power, the conversation turns moral. The incumbent positions itself as the ethical option, the protector of jobs, communities, safety, and fairness. The disruptor is painted as reckless, greedy, or harmful. This stage is emotionally compelling, and it often resonates internally. But it's also revealing. When the debate becomes about values instead of customers, control of the market is already slipping. The final stage isn't marked by defeat in court or loss of an argument. It's marked by indifference. Consumers stop listening. The old definitions no longer shape behavior. The new model becomes the default, and the market's language changes to reflect that reality. At this point, resistance may continue, but authority is gone. And once authority is gone, it rarely comes back. When you strip it down, the pattern is simple. First, it's not real. Then, it doesn't count. Then, it's not right. And finally, it's irrelevant. These aren't just reactions. They're signals. And if you know which signal you're hearing, you can predict what comes next. This cycle isn't unique to transportation. You can see it in media, in photography, in mobile phones, in retail, in almost every major industry that's been disrupted. The technology changes, the companies change, but the psychological response stays the same. Disruption doesn't sneak up on organizations, it reveals how they think. The real value of this framework isn't hindsight, it's diagnosis. By paying attention to language, you can tell exactly where an industry is. Are leaders dismissing the threat, attacking legitimacy, moralizing the conversation, or being quietly ignored? Those cues don't just tell you where things stand, they tell you where they're heading. The greatest risk in disruption is not being wrong. Markets can tolerate mistakes. They can even tolerate hesitation. What they do not tolerate is irrelevance. The danger isn't losing the argument, it's continuing to argue after the market has already moved on. That's the moment authority quietly disappears. So as you leave this conversation, the most important question isn't whether disruption is fair, justified, or even correct. It's whether your organization is still shaping the language of the market or reacting to it. Because by the time you realize you're being ignored, the disruption isn't coming. It's already complete.